Hello and welcome to one more episode of the Allplane podcast, where you will find inspiring stories of innovation in the commercial aviation industry. First of all, let me remind you that you can find all the previous episodes of this podcast, as well as many other inspiring stories about aviation, on our website, Allplane.tv. That's Allplane.tv. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is becoming increasingly popular: sustainable aviation fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel has taken a very prominent place in the public debate. It's not exactly a new technology, but it has taken a very prominent place in the public debate. There is a very pressing need to decarbonize aviation, and the new propulsion technologies such as electric flight and hydrogen-powered aircraft are still being developed and, in the best of cases, a few years away from being available at scale. It is in this context that sustainable aviation fuel, which is made from biomass, from different types of waste, or even through synthetic production methods, has emerged as a ready alternative that can also be used with the aircraft and the infrastructure that are already in place. The problem is that supply is very limited at the moment, and the cost is much higher than conventional fuel, like 3 to 5 times higher. So what can be done? What is the current situation in the sustainable aviation fuel industry? And which production methods are more promising? What are their perspectives? We are going to try to answer all these questions today with Jonathan Wood. He is a VP for renewable aviation at Neste, the Finnish energy firm that is currently the global market leader in sustainable aviation fuel. So tune in for a comprehensive overview of this very promising technology.
Hello, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Mikhail. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much for making time today for this conversation, because we are living through very interesting times in the sustainable aviation fuel industry. It's pretty much every day that we get news about a new initiative, a new project, a new airline that has launched a program to use more sustainable aviation fuel. So I thought what best than to have one of the You've been working in this industry for quite some time, and you are now a VP at one of the top players in the sustainable aviation fuel industry. That's a Finnish company, Neste. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your professional background, and about your current role before we move on to discussing general situation of the industry and particularly the very interesting projects that you are conducting at Neste?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mikhail, for the chance to talk, and nice to get to know you. You're absolutely right. There's a lot going on in this space. I think if we look at a macro level, it's clear the last couple of years that greenhouse gas and carbon emissions have become more and more of a topic, whether it's Flugskam and Greta Thunberg, whether it's, I would say, an elevated recognition of climate change risks through this pandemic, and then a number of reports coming out as we head towards the climate change conference COP26 in Scotland in November. I think it's very clear that the imperative to take action is becoming clearer and clearer. But yeah, we'll get into that and what's happening in the aviation and SAF space. But with respect to myself, yeah, I'm now VP for Neste's renewable aviation or SAF business in Europe and ASPAC. A new space for Neste, but Neste obviously has a lot of experience in producing renewable fuels and recycling waste materials. But before joining at the beginning of last year Neste to take on this role, I was for many years in ABP, responsible for the growth agenda, responsible for business development in new geographies and with new products and services, and had indeed had some involvement in the low carbon fuels or SAF space. And prior to that, many years in commercial roles with BP in the fuels business around the world.
Sustainable aviation fuel has come to the top of the agenda, let's say. It's quite surprising because as far as I can remember, there was a lot of buzz in the media about electric flight, more recently about hydrogen. But all of a sudden, it seems that sustainable aviation fuel has taken a much more prominent space. Is this because it has come to be regarded as perhaps a more pragmatic approach to fulfill the very ambitious climate and emissions goals? What do you think is happening here?
I think, in a nutshell, you're probably right. I mean, IATA set goals more than 10 years ago to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 versus a 2005 baseline. And already in those times, we were talking about new aircraft technology to improve efficiency, which has been, as we all know, I mean, the industry has a great track record in terms of continuously improving the efficiency of the aircraft. But, you know, what can be done in terms of new propulsion technologies, as you say, to change the game there, be it hydrogen, be it electric. Then we've got operational efficiencies, and then you've got liquid fuel types that reduce net emissions. And all of those were seen as being important 10 years ago. If you fast forward to the ATAG IATA report that came out at the end of last year, I think it reconfirmed that all of those strands have a role to play. But if we think about the next 10 years, I think SAF is the piece that can play the most material role, in particular in the 10 to 15 year time frame. And then let's see whether new propulsion technologies can really emerge thereafter. But I think you know, what's clear, what most of the industry experts talk about is how electric may be more of a solution for a shorter haul and smaller aircraft. But as soon as you get into longer haul and larger aircraft, I think liquid fuels are going to play a role as far as we can see right. We've got production technologies for SAF in place now, and as we all know, and many production technologies have been approved by ASTM, but the HEFA-based hydrotreated esters and fatty acids process is the one that's most available today and is being scaled up by Neste and other players. But then we've got to really make sure that we do actually progress the other technology pathways, be it alcohol to jet, be it use of municipal solid waste and the Fischer-Tropsch gasification, and ultimately be hopefully the use of renewable energy and capturing of carbon to create so-called eSAF or power-to-liquid based SAFs, maybe from the 2030s onwards. All of them, I believe, have a role to play. And I think we really need to recognize that there's no one silver bullet here. Whether it's new aircraft propulsion technologies, operational efficiencies, which make sense under all scenarios, and then in the SAF field, let's make sure we pursue and drive forward with all the different production technologies. And then time will tell which ones we can really drive the cost down furthest on through scale economies and so on, and the learning effects. I mean, we've all seen what's happened in the last 20 years with the massive growth of renewable energy, with wind power and solar. And we really need to take the same, I believe, attitude to aviation fuel and see which production technologies ultimately prove to be the best for the long term. But I think over the next 10 years, we need to run with what we've got, because the IPCC report that was issued just a couple of weeks ago in the lead up to the COP conference made it, I think, very clear for everybody. We can't wait another 10 years. We're seeing it around us today, what's happening with climate change. We're already well over 1 degree centigrade above the levels of the 19th century, and we're on track to sail past the 1.5 degree target that the Paris conference 5 years ago set. So we really need to take what we've got now and in parallel develop all of the options for the future. The challenge, of course, then is that, of course, none of these options come at the same cost as the current fossil jet fuel option. And I would argue, that's an issue that we need to come to terms with, because it's actually not a fair comparison, because, as I've just said, the fossil jet fuel option is not really an option for society when we look forward.
At this point, I would start maybe by doing a quick recap of the different methods and technologies that are there available, because as you mentioned, there are different ways to obtain sustainable, what can be labeled as sustainable aviation fuel, HEFA system, HEFA.
HEFA, yeah.
HEFA, yeah. Then there's the Fischer-Tropsch, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. process. It's a process that was developed a very long time ago, I think about 100 years ago, but it's proven to be one of the ways that you can obtain sustainable aviation fuel. You have alcohol to jet fuel, which is based on some organic feedstock, starchy vegetables. Then you have all the wall of synthetic fuels, which is basically creating them from non-organic material. So all of these processes are currently kind of being developed in parallel by different people, different entrepreneurs, different companies. From what you said, at Neste, you are most active in the HEFA system. Is that right?
That's correct. We developed 10 years or more ago some proprietary technology, production technology expertise, which has enabled Neste to already establish a quite material renewable diesel fuel business. We're now applying that technology know-how to produce with an extra step and indeed as a result some extra cost renewable jet fuel or SAF. And we're also as Neste taking our know-how into the renewable polymers and chemicals business as well. So as a feedstock, a renewable feedstock for the chemicals industry. That's just I'd say the most material production technology currently in use, and as I say, in particular for renewable diesel, and now being applied for renewable jet fuel. But those other technology pathways that you just referred to have been approved some years ago by ASTM, and you've got different companies developing pilot plants. I know that in the municipal solid waste, you've got Fulcrum, which has just completed its pilot plant in the US. You've got companies like Velocis talking about developing projects in the UK. Then you've got, as you said, the alcohol to jet route with companies like LanzaTech working in partnership with other companies to develop projects. And then, as you say, the power to liquids power to liquids pathway, which I think will take a little bit longer to properly develop the electrolysis of capturing of hydrogen out of water with electrolysis, combining that with the capturing of carbon from either industrial emissions or from direct air capture to then create a liquid fuel. As Neste, what I would say is we're building and we're investing significantly in the technology we know today, but we're also certainly investing time and effort to understand with also partners what those future technologies could look like. And we as Neste are certainly committed to also developing, bringing on stream capacity as and when it's ready with those other future technologies as well.
Mm-hmm. So basically, to summarize, what's the feedstock for each of these processes? Because when I've been reading about sustainable aviation fuel, well, on paper it sounds like a very straightforward way to get less carbon intensive fuel. But if I understand it correctly, there's a bit of a bottleneck with the raw material, with the sourcing of the raw materials, apart from higher production costs. So that those would be two major bottlenecks here to have a bigger sustainable aviation fuel industry. As a result of that, I think the intake at the moment in the aviation industry is less than 1%.
Yes, you're absolutely right that right now the production capacity for SAF is significantly less than 1%. I'll come in a second to how we see that growing over time. Certainly some independent reports which indicate that could grow to, say, 10% of global demand by 2030. But to your point about feedstocks, your raw materials, you're right that that's a key issue. But so long as we keep an open mind to feedstocks, whilst at the same time, obviously, maintaining the requirements that they are truly sustainable. In other words, they aren't causing indirect land use change. They should not be impacting biodiversity and the like. But there are a number of biogenic raw materials available that could certainly allow for the production to be expanded, as I say, to 10% and beyond of all aviation fuel demand. So the way we see it, we've got wastes and so-called residue lipids, so waste oils and fats which we see having availability of some 35 to 40 million tons a year.
Those are the ones that you use in Neste right now, right?
Exactly, and those are the raw materials we use in this heifer-based production method today. But that could be expanded if we have an open mind to, I would say, agricultural and forestry residues, also crops from use of biogenic raw materials from degraded land that otherwise would not be used, or even potentially intermediate crops where the land is otherwise fallow or not being used. So there is a way by which we can significantly increase beyond the 40 million tons of waste oils and fats that are currently available, to probably, if you include municipal solid waste as well, there would be, if you take all of those sources, sufficient raw materials to actually produce enough SAF to meet global aviation fuel demand. And I'm talking about pre-COVID levels. So that's the view. If you, I mean, there was a World Economic Forum Clean Skies for Tomorrow report issued, and the Clean Skies for Tomorrow coalition is a combination of airlines, suppliers, airports, industry players. And the view taken in that investigation was that indeed, yes, there is sufficient raw material, so long as we don't constrain ourselves artificially to use biogenic raw materials and then also municipal waste, and ultimately that would get us to potentially 100% of global aviation demand. And then, as I say, the power to liquids approach would then obviously have, in theory, unlimited resources, so long as we can get hold of the renewable power at a sensible cost.
The materials are there, but are they in the right places? Because one thing that makes me wonder here is how the logistic chain for the sourcing of all these materials works. Because you might have, I don't know, like forestry residue in Scandinavia, for example. Then you might have waste oils coming from everywhere, really. Is there the infrastructure in place to collect all these waste materials from many different locations and bring them to the production facilities? Or that's something that this is a sort of a logistic chain that would need to be built eventually from scratch or from almost scratch? Because at the moment, as you mentioned, the production levels are relatively small.
Yeah, so yes, this can be managed. I agree that it's a more complex operation, and it's a higher cost operation than moving fossil-based crude oil in super tankers around the world. But and it may result in smaller production plants, more widely distributed. But we at Neste are certainly ensuring that we are able to manage the supply sourcing of raw materials. That's almost as important an activity as the marketing of it once it's made and the bringing to market. So, we envisage having production facilities in all of the major continents, and are investing, as we speak, in Singapore, in Asia, and obviously in Europe. So, but yes, it's certainly true to say that if you look at the production plants that are being, or production projects on the drawing board, they are widely distributed, because the different raw materials, certainly if you're going from municipal solid waste, you're probably going to be in the major urban centres. If you're trying to source all of these biogenic raw materials, then you need to have quite a sophisticated sourcing setup and pre-treatment facilities as well.
Mm-hmm. How vertically integrated is this sustainable aviation fuel industry? For example, at Neste, do you take care of all the value chain, all the way from the origination of all these feedstocks, all the way to the, let's say, when the final distribution, where the hose basically fills the aircraft tank?
I would say that at Neste we are quite vertically integrated. It's especially in terms of the feedstock sourcing. There have been a number of announcements in the last year made by Neste demonstrating our desire to ensure we have reliable sourcing of the feedstocks, the production facilities, and then the marketing of those. When it comes to bringing it to market, we are comfortable working with partners because we recognise that there are established distribution networks and infrastructure. And the great thing, obviously, about renewable fuels is it's typically a drop-in fuel, so they're fungible. So you can put them in the existing infrastructure and, of course, in the existing aircraft or road vehicles. So
it's blended before it's
in the case of
it's
SAF,
supplied to aircraft. Yeah.
In the case of SAF, you're absolutely right. Of course, it currently is only approved up to a 50% blend. In the case of road transportation, you don't need to blend it. But the point is that at that point, from that point, you can put it in the existing infrastructure. So as I say, Neste, yes, we have established positions at particular airports, but we're also very comfortable working with partners to ensure that the product is brought to as many users as possible. I mean, this is a business which is still in its early stages of growth, and over the next 10 years, I'm sure, I believe that it will grow quite rapidly, and so it's absolutely essential that we make it available to the different channels to market.
That would be a HEFA system feeding on organic waste materials.
Yeah.
Then the Fischer troughs. What goes into the Fischer troughs? What's the raw material?
Well, municipal solid waste is the feedstock which is being developed most. I mean, there's a sorting exercise that needs to take place there before that raw material can then be processed into ultimately feedstock for the production of a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. So, I mean, ultimately, it is still predominantly biogenic in origin.
Mm-hmm. There's an element here that I find quite interesting is some of these processes, they basically feed on waste. In a way, that's a secondary positive effect, I guess, that you are getting rid of waste and recycling waste, giving it a new use.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it's hard what's not to like about an approach like that. And quite frankly, Neste is all about recycling waste materials that are already in our ecosystem and making them useful again. So that's an underlying theme which I think is spreading not just in the SAF business, but more generally across society, as we realise that we've got to change how we live and create more of a circular recycling economy.
Yeah, saving landfill space as well along
exactly.
the way. Interesting. Then we have to make here like a point that when we talk about sustainable aviation fuel, that means that you don't want to subtract organic production from crops that feed people. I think it was about a decade ago when biofuels became popular. There was, I think, some inflation, like food inflation in parts of the world, because some crops were devoted to, and land was devoted to producing biofuels instead of food crops. So, and the same thing goes for just cutting trees and cutting biomass to do stuff. Yeah. So those would be byproducts of already existing processes, so that they're going to be used instead of going to waste.
Yeah, we're very clear as Neste, and I think now the standards for SAF, the SAF industry, are very clear. It has to be sustainable. That means there can't be indirect land use change. Yeah. It has to be from established sources. It has to be waste product that would otherwise not be useful for human consumption, for example. And this fuel versus food debate, we're not negatively impacting food availability.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And there's a whole certification process there. There are certification labels that basically make sure that this is the case in order to be labeled as sustainable. Then we have the alcohol to jet. What can you tell us about this process? So that comes from the feedstock is starchy vegetables, right?
Yeah, I mean you're right. That's certainly the lines of my understanding. I have to say I'm probably not so familiar with that production pathway, but I know that there are companies looking to develop projects. Lanza Tech is probably one of the leaders in the space in different continents. So hopefully that will prove to be successful as well.
And then we would have the synthetic fuels, as you mentioned earlier, that basically use electrolysis and hopefully green power to take carbon and then through a series of chemical reactions they produce synthetic fuels. They're expected to play quite a big role in achieving the EU goal I think it's pretty ambitious goal, like having 60+% of fuel being sustainable by 2050. And of this amount, a very significant part would have to be synthetic fuel. So there's a special provision for synthetic fuels, I guess, because if the market has to grow that much, then we would be having some problem here sourcing all this organic feedstock, right? So we would need to get other sources for sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah, you're right. The renewable power-based power to liquids approach is going to be key and probably will represent in 2050 half or more of the total liquid SAF available. But it's important to remember two things. One, it's not available now. It's still got it's not at the technology readiness level to be commercially scaled up yet. So let's build what we can, or consume what we can by bringing to market SAF using the technologies that are available today, and then the power to liquids approach can build on that. So it's not about replacing; it's about building on those technologies that can already make a significant contribution over the next 10 years, and then build on that with additional power to liquids capacity.
We've talked about the feedstocks a lot, but what about the production? I mean, sustainable aviation fuel at the moment is more expensive than conventional jet fuel. Up to what point this is because of the production process? Up to which point this is due to scale? Basically, are we here in a chicken and egg situation where because there's still a small scale production, costs are higher, and then that in turn makes it less attractive to produce it, and we are kind of in a vicious circle? How much is due to the intrinsic difficulty of producing these fuels, and how hopeful you are that the production process is going to basically evolve in a direction that would bring these costs down in the near future?
Yeah, so I would agree with you. It's definitely a chicken and egg situation where the higher cost means less demand, which means less investment, which means higher cost. So we're definitely in that situation. The different production technologies have a different balance in terms of what's driving the cost. So the heifer-based technology is more aligned on a larger portion of the cost is driven by the feedstock or raw materials, compared with municipal solid waste-based fish and trops production, where you've got a much higher capital investment up front, a much higher investment for a lower production capacity, but then your ongoing raw material costs are potentially close to zero. I think when you go to power to liquids, then actually, yes, you've got raw materials in the form of renewable power, which right now is more costly, and therefore that needs to definitely also come down. So the different technologies have a different balance between capital cost and operational cost and raw material cost.
May I ask something here?
I'm sure that over time the costs can be brought down, but we're looking at, depending on what the fossil jet fuel prices at any time. Over the last year, we've looked at prices for SAF, which are somewhere between 3 and 5 times that of fossil jet fuel. Do I think that will come down over time? Yes, but it depends a little bit on what the fossil jet fuel price is, of course. But the future technologies are higher cost, but they probably have more opportunity to reduce their cost over time as we get more experience in them. We should not assume that by pursuing these production technologies, we can necessarily get lower cost. And and there may be less volatility. It depends a little bit on which production method you're employing. But I think there's certainly got to be a huge investment to get the production capacity up and the cost down. And this is where policy and incentives can be so important in helping drive a level of demand or stimulate a level of demand, which will help encourage the investment to be made to scale up. And whether you take the incentives approach, which is largely the approach in the US or in some European markets, or you move towards the mandated model, which some European markets have now adopted, where a certain proportion of fuel has to be renewable. And that's, by the way, in Europe, an approach which has worked successfully for road fuels. So it looks like with the EU Fit for 55 policy package that's the pathway that is going to be adopted in the European Union. And indeed, it looks like the UK is probably going down a similar pathway. The key is that we encourage a level of demand which helps drive the investment to grow supply.
I wanted to ask you about this because the refuel document published by the European Union sets up these percentages, these goals, mentions as well that over 100 new plants will need to be built in order to supply this market in the coming couple of decades. But there is little detail about who's going to build these plants, where the capital is going to come from. And my question here is, there are those goals, but what's going to be the trigger for the financial and industry players to take action and go from words to action and allocate the capital there? I guess one thing we are seeing now in the market is large corporates, for example, that have large travel budgets, that have sustainability programs. They are committing now to paying for sustainable aviation fuel. Is that enough of an incentive for the industry to invest? Is this sort of, let's say, public commitment or public goal setting enough to invest in more production capacity? What are normally the drivers in this type of cases where the government sets a goal, which can be rather abstract, but then, there's some way to go to meet it?
Yeah, well, I think that the government has got a role to play here in setting goals, as you say. And in Europe, let's see where the current discussions end up. But certainly a 5% goal, and so 5% of all aviation fuel should be SAF by 2030. It might end up being higher. Let's see. Certainly, I know many member states have goals of 30% of all aviation fuel being SAF by 2030. If that becomes an obligation, like on the like on the road transport fuel side, then the suppliers have to make it available. The cost is borne by the end user, be they a private consumer or a corporate consumer. So it does come at an extra cost, but if you do it this way, it's a level playing field. There's no competitive distortion. Certainly, if you've got a similar level across a region, such as the European region, and it helps drive and provides a framework in which companies can then make investment decisions. In the US, the philosophy is one of providing incentives, but the end result is the same. If it becomes competitive with fossil jet fuel after taking into account the incentives, then it will help drive demand, even if it's as a result of a mandate on the road transportation side. Although, who knows, with the Biden administration, we're seeing potentially the possibility of a mandate for SAF as well.
We are seeing lots of activity in the US so far, and on the industry side. Actually, yesterday we got an announcement by United Airlines as well, committing to sustainable aviation fuel purchases. I don't know what's the situation in other major aviation markets in China, in India, Brazil. What's a view there in those markets about sustainable?
Well, our view is we're seeing Europe and North America, US, and to a degree Canada, are the leaders. In Asia, or ASPAC, we see emerging interest. We as Neste have supplied sustainable aviation fuel into Japan, and we're hopeful that we'll be supplying it into other markets in the near future. You're seeing one or two countries like New Zealand and Australia talk about policy and a mandate. In the case of New Zealand, there is a consultation process underway. So we're seeing, I would say, the start of the policy discussions in ASPAC. I think they're much more well developed in Europe and North America, and I'm sure the other regions will follow as well. But I would just like to also mention something you referred to earlier. It's not just about policy setting a certain mandate level or a certain level of incentive. We are seeing now voluntary additional demand for SAF to reduce emissions from corporates and to a degree from the private consumer. There are a few programs out there where consumers, when such as ourselves, when we travel for private leisure purposes, we can
to top up.
We can effectively pay the extra so that SAF is used for what would equate to the carbon emissions for our trip, and that's something that is now being, there are companies like Lufthansa with the Compensate program, and you're now seeing that deployed at greater scale with corporates. So whether it's BCG, Microsoft, Google, or whoever, who are saying as part of their company philosophy and environmental and sustainability goals, that they want to reduce so-called Scope 3 carbon emissions, where they're traveling and basically pay for SAF in order to ensure that they are zero or close to zero net emissions. And also on the cargo side, once again, it's ultimately driven by the end consumer. There are companies that believe that reducing the emissions associated with the production of their products is something they want to sign up for. So you're now seeing cargo, which of course in the aviation world right now is the healthiest part financially of the commercial airline business. Seeing and shippers willing to pay for SAF to be used. So those are all, I would say, voluntary additional sources of funding the demand growth.
Just to explain to those listening that might not be familiar with this type of programs, actually we mentioned it in another podcast I did recently with Maria Fiskerud, a Nordic expert, that we're talking about in Sweden, some similar initiatives. So basically people booking a flight would have the chance to basically pay a bit extra during the booking process, just as when people do offsets, for example. But in this case, instead of an offset, it would be paying extra to cover this extra cost of sustainable aviation fuel. That means not necessarily that the fuel in that particular flight they are taking will be sustainable fuel, but overall they're bringing sustainable aviation fuel into the system by helping covering this price differential. So that's something that many airlines now are implementing. I think British Airways just a few days ago announced the launch of its own sustainable aviation fuel voluntary purchase program. As you mentioned, also Lufthansa, SAS has the same thing as well. So it's becoming more and more general.
And what I would just like to say on that, we've heard about how cost is the challenging issue for SAF right now, and we all get that the airlines can't simply pay the extra cost and expect to stay financially viable. But if we put it in terms of what it costs for the end customer, and there was a study done in an independent study for the Finnish government, I think it was at the end of last year, which looked at what the extra cost was. So for a European flight, if you had 10% of all of the fuel being SAF, it would cost less than $10. So less than $1 for every percent SAF. For longer haul, it's slightly more, but it's less than $4 or $5 for every percent. It is SAF rather than regular fossil jet fuel. So on the one hand, yes, it's a significant extra cost for the airlines. But on the other, if you translate into what it means for the end customer, I think we need to leave it to the audience to decide if that's a reasonable cost.
And what about the distribution? Because at the moment, SAF it's available at only a limited number of airports. So limited that I think I saw a map. It was online the other day. I don't remember the source. I'll check it out and I will try to post a link in the show notes. But it's actually you can count the number of airports where SAF is available on a normal basis, basically with your fingers, because there are not that many places where you can source it. what are the prospects for the rollout of a proper distribution network downstream? We have talked about the logistics of getting all the feedstocks to the plants. How many more plants are going to have to be built? Many of them in new locations because they're going to be maybe closer to the source of feedstock or closer to the markets. But what about downstream distribution? Where is this blending taking place? What is the sort of infrastructure you would need to have in place for pretty much every flight having a percentage of sustainable aviation fuel on board?
I think Eurocontrol have done some analysis that I think it's 30 or 40 locations that have had SAF, but maybe not on a regular ongoing basis, but in Europe. But either way, I agree we need to make it available in more locations. But it is now available in a number of locations, and certainly that will increase over the next year. We are, as Neste, making it available to other established oil company aviation fuel marketers, because we recognize that you often have to be, not all airports are open access, let's put it like that. So you have to own a shareholding in the established infrastructure at the airports. We as Neste are willing to work with those established distributors because our interest is about growing the market and making it available to the market. Fundamentally, you were saying, well, what level of infrastructure investment is going to be required to make this available? I would say, yes, we will need some storage and blending infrastructure. And we obviously need the production facilities, the production plants. But the distribution network doesn't need to be dramatically changed, because once it's blended, it can go just like any other jet fuel, down the pipe, on the vessel, in the truck, on the train. It doesn't need new infrastructure. There's a lot of uncertainty, and everybody's safety conscious, and rightly so. But actually, it doesn't need any new infrastructure at the airports.
One of the things I realized is that when you read about new sustainable aviation fuel being made available in some new airport or something like that, very often the name Neste came up very often. So even if the company that is actually sending the press release is another one, that it's often like SAF supplied by Neste. So I just wanted to ask you about what's the story, how Neste chose to become a pioneer in this field. It seems that at least in Europe, you are one of the few suppliers, or one of the major suppliers, depending on how you see it, of sustainable aviation fuel. I read that you also have some production facilities that are in the making in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. Yeah. You have a plant in Singapore as well that I don't know if it's already active or not yet. But it seems that Neste has made a strategic choice of being a sort of the major player in this field. And I wanted to ask you specifically about your projects in this area and what can we expect in the next few years.
Yeah, so you're right. Neste is a leader in Europe and is also one of the major supplier in North America. Neste produces today about 3 million tons per annum of renewable fuel.
But that's not only for aviation. That includes biofuel as well.
So that 3 million tons that we're producing today is predominantly renewable diesel. Our production capacity today for SAF is about 100,000 tons. We are investing right now, as you correctly said, in Singapore and in Rotterdam. So and in 2023, our production capacity for SAF will increase from 100,000 tons to 1.5 million tons.
May I ask you, these 100,000 tons, where are they produced now? In Finland or somewhere else?
The 100,000 tons that we make currently is produced to start with in our refinery in Finland. We then have a final production step in the Rotterdam area, and we then blend it and store it in the Rotterdam-Ghent area, and then make it available by all the different logistics methods to the European market. And so that 100,000 tons is going to grow to 1.5 million tons. And we project, and indeed the Clean Skies for Tomorrow analysis also indicated that by 2025, roughly 8 million tons worth of sustainable aviation fuel capacity could be available if you base it off all the projects that have been announced, and you maximize your SAF yield versus your renewable diesel yield. And so we as Neste certainly envisage remaining to be a major player. That 1.5 million tons is what we will have available in 2023. So our production capacity of renewable fuels will grow from 3 million to 4.5 million tons. And then over and above that, we're looking at additional plant investments, both using this HEFA-based technology, as well as also looking at the longer term at some of the other production technologies that we spoke about earlier. So, the message is that, we need to invest a lot. We need to grow the production capacity, and Neste certainly envisages being a major player going forward as well.
Mm-hmm. So just making sense of all these numbers, at the moment you're producing 100,000. So that's supposed to, in 2 years, is going to jump to 1.5 million. So from 1.5 million tons in 2023, you said you plan to jump to 4.5?
No, sorry. That what I was saying was Neste currently has 3 million tons worth of renewable fuel capacity, and we will grow it to 4.5.
Okay, understood.
So what you're seeing is the growth in the SAF production capacity from 100,000 to 1.5 million. And that's by 2023. And then I would say we have announced the intention to also invest in another, I'll call it world-scale plant, which we'll make a final investment decision on in the next year. So that's already demonstrating we're not stopping there. Our intention is to continue to grow the renewable fuels capacity, both for road transportation as well as for aviation. Okay, and just as you mentioned, to put in context, by 2025, the global production capacity of sustainable aviation fuel, it's going to be 8 million tons. Right. That's, if you look at the World Economic Forum Clean Skies for Tomorrow report from the end of last year, that was their view. It could be less, but it could be as much as 8 million tons in 2025. So, I mean, I think that shows 8 million tons would be probably about 5% of global aviation fuel demand, assuming we recover from COVID. Just a bit more than 5% probably. I think that's probably a best case. But we as Neste certainly are investing, and this will. We're not the only ones. So there have been a number of announcements in North America. True. You've got other players looking at HEFA capacity in Europe as well. And quite interesting that we have seen major airlines as well investing. In some cases, in more than one project, like British Airways, for example, is invested in a couple of different projects using different processes and with a different geographical footprint as well, because they are investing in the US and in the UK. In the US, we are seeing also some players investing. In Europe, KLM is also a partner in a number of projects. Synthetic fuels as well. There are some projects that have airlines and even airports, because we had here on the podcast a Swiss company called Synhelion that has Zurich Airport as a partner as well. So it's quite interesting how all the different aviation players are kind of getting involved in this production, in this development of production capacity. All right, so then we are aiming at around 5%, something like around 5% is what's to be expected around 2025, 5% of the total jet fuel market, well, considering there are no sudden changes in market conditions like the ones we've seen this last couple of years. And then you are opening the Rotterdam and Singapore facilities soon as well, right? Yeah. Do you have a date for those to come on stream? Yeah, well, I think what has been communicated publicly is that Singapore would be coming on stream in early 2023. Okay. And the Rotterdam investment will be completed in the latter part of 2023.
Mm-hmm. The Singapore one, is it for the Asia Pacific market, or because
it's for all markets? It's for all markets.
Okay. Well, I think we cover lots of ground, lots of interesting stuff happening in this industry. For people that want to learn more about the work you do at Neste and overall the sustainable aviation fuel landscape, what resources would you recommend? Websites, social media channels, other information resources that might be informative about this space?
Yeah, well, the Neste sites, LinkedIn, and all that kind of those kind of sources of information. I mean, there have been a number of reports generated over the last 12 months to help inform, which I think are really valuable in informing the debate. I've referred to the World Economic Forum Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition and the reports they produced at the end of last year and this year with analysis of what they believe is possible from a feedstock and a production point of view, and how that plays into then what policy options there are. I know there was the ATAG report at the end of last year, which looked to 2050 as to what was possible, and in my mind that was a build on work that IATA has done over 10 years, and showing how SAF the different kinds of SAF and how SAF is one part of the solution alongside different aircraft technologies and operational efficiencies. And then the other report is the I think it was Airlines for Europe and ACI issued a report that I forget the name of it, but that was also I think a valuable. I can't recall the title of it.
I'll look for it. I'll look for it, and if I can find the link, I'll post it in the show notes as well.
I think everybody recognises there are solutions for today and there are solutions for tomorrow. There's no silver bullet. Let's not try and fixate on one technology or one answer. We need to work on this together. And I think what you were saying earlier, the industry is collaborating together, which it's got to be a positive.
Indeed. Well, Jonathan, it's been very, very interesting to get this great overview of this industry, this growing segment of the energy industry and of the aviation industry as well. Now it's pretty much every week we're seeing an announcement about sustainable aviation fuel. But if we are to get to those very ambitious goals that set up by the European Union and possibly by other governments in the near future, definitely there's going to have to be some serious expansion of production capacity. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for your time today, and hopefully speak soon. All those new plans and new projects come on stream.
Yeah, look forward to it. Absolutely. Thanks for the time, Mikhail.
A pleasure. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Before you go, and if you like this podcast, a quick reminder that it would be absolutely great if you could please give it a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're using, or recommend it to a friend or whomever might be interested. Thank you very much and see you soon.